Welcome back, everybody. You're listening to Cut the Shit, a podcast series that aims to take a closer look at the impact of the IT industry, both the good and the bad. Cut the Shit is brought to you by Plow Networks, a managed IT services company based just outside Nashville, Tennessee. I'm Bryan Link, EVP of Products and Services here at Plow, and I'll be your host for this series. I'll ask questions, and with the help of our guests, try to dig deep on some of the key challenges we all face dealing with IT. So with that, let's cut the shit and get started. On today's episode, I am super excited to have Scott Breece as our guest. Scott is a 20-year IT veteran who got his start on the networking side of the house and then moved into security at HCA and never looked back. Since then, he has progressed into Chief Security Officer roles, first at Community Health Systems and then at Cerner, which recently became part of Oracle Health, where he is today. Scott has broad IT expertise, so we decided to focus our conversation on IT budgeting. Yeah, I know what you're thinking, but trust me, this is way more interesting than you might expect. Scott shares his early experiences with IT budgeting, how he learned to get better at it, and what are his suggestions for how to make the process work better for anyone having to create or review an IT budget for their company. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Scott Breece. Scott, welcome to Cut the Shit. How are things today?
Great. Thank you for having me, Bryan.
I'm glad to have you. We're excited. Hey, before we dive into kind of the meat of the discussion, I always like to start with, something kind of, I call it a warm up, whatever you want to call it. But give me an example, and you may have to think about it a bit, but give me an example of of the most interesting use of technology, kind of a hack that you've seen recently, either from clients or colleagues or kids or whatever, just something that you might have seen someone using technology in a way that's kind of interesting.
That's a good one. I can't think of anything right off the top of my head, but it's interesting to watch my 11-year-old do TikToks. I mean, it's like, that's all they do is sit around and TikTok.
Is this a boy or girl?
11-year-old girl. So
okay.
She's like, some of that stuff, my wife and I were like, how does she get so creative in these things? I mean, it's insane. But that's the only thing I could think of right off the top of my head. It's been a minute since I've seen any kind of interesting technology used for something.
Okay, that was I probably ought to stop asking that question, frankly, because it made more sense during lockdown stuff, because people had a bunch of examples of things that people were doing to figure out how to make stuff happen while they couldn't go to the office or at home or something like that. But like, that's all priced in now. Like, it's not that interesting anymore. Everybody's figured that out. So.
Well, I will share that I bought some new icicle lights for outside this year, and who knew that you could get a set of icicle lights with 10 different settings? I mean,
what would Clark Griswold have done if he had those? I mean, he wouldn't have known what to do with himself.
Insane. It looked like a rave party the other night with my daughter out there helping me hang the lights, because she put it on this one setting, and it was just like a big style of lights going on. And I was like, man.
Well, it reminds me of my Cut the Shit sign behind us, which has something like that too. Or I could change the setting. So I won't do that to distract anyone, but I always use that if the meeting gets boring, I go to that as an alternative. So
there you go.
All right, well, let's get to the main event.
Sure.
To get us started, why don't you introduce yourself? Give us again, I've already told the people who you are, but give us a quick thumbnail sketch on your background and how you got started in technology.
All right. I don't want to really.
It only happened a couple years ago. I mean, you're brand new to you're brand new to the field. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I wish I was. No, I've been in IT for 22 years. So it's I started out at a Thomson technology company building patient forecasting and planning databases, and went to a couple of small companies in between before going to HCA and then Community Health Systems, and now I went to Cerner, and then we got acquired by Oracle. So now I'm the CISO for Oracle Health and AI. So we're making that transition into Oracle right now.
Got it. So how did that? It sounds like you weren't necessarily on the security side. So how did the transition into security specifically happen? Was it a natural progression, or was that a discrete choice you made?
It was a discrete choice. I, was doing database administration and network administrator for a company, and then started reading up on security as it was becoming big. And I think at the time it was IP tables in Red Hat Linux, and so it it intrigued me. And then this company across town, I don't even know if they're still in business anymore, a very small company. They were looking for a security guy. And so they brought me in and they said, you have 3 months to build a firewall using a Linux-based platform. And so I did that. Next thing I know, they were sending me all over the South, Southeast, Southwest, and putting in internet connections and IP tables firewalls. So that's how I got started.
Got it. So you were half network, half security, which I guess kind of goes together really at the end of the day.
Yeah, it does. Very close.
Awesome. All right. Well, so given your background and you know, you and I've talked some, so I know sort of the breadth of things that you've dealt with and continue to deal with. There are a lot of different directions we could go with this conversation, and we may have to have you back on for a part 2 at some point to talk about some of the other angles. But today I wanted to zoom in a bit on IT budgeting, which, you know, if you're listening, don't fall asleep just quite yet. It's not going to be what you think. I know IT budgeting doesn't get most people super excited, but it's super important. And so we want to talk a little bit about that and maybe how managers can, you know, maybe do this better or at least think about it in some new and creative ways for this really important task. So to kick it off, you know, I thought, let's start with you and your relationship to budgeting, to the budgeting process. What was the first time you remember having to put together either a whole budget or part of a budget for review and approval? Can you think back on that and try to can you describe that experience for us?
Yeah. So it was my first job out of college, and
so you got into the game early then, because most people don't. Most people aren't that lucky, Scott.
yeah, that was back in '99. And I was probably on the job maybe 2-3 months, and you know, my boss comes over and he's like, "Hey, I need you to be in this budget meeting with me tomorrow, and here's a list of things we got to prep for." And I'm sitting there looking at it, and I'm like, I don't think I know what OpEx means, what CapEx means. I don't understand these things. And he's like, think about it from a perspective of what's coming out of your checking account versus what the bank's going to give you a loan for. And I was like, oh, well, that's simple. And so
that's actually pretty good. That's a pretty good example. Yeah, that's not bad. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's like, if you don't want money coming out of your pocket, there's no need to buy it. And I was like, okay, how much am I allowed to borrow? He goes, within reason. I was like, okay. So I went around to all the other team members and we compiled a list of everything that we wanted, from software to training to travel. Let's see, what else was it? And in any of the existing stuff that we had. And so, and team building, we put team building in there for sure.
Got to have some beer money. Yeah.
Yeah, I know, right? So I put that list together, and I got into his office about 4:30 on the day before. That was the day that he gave me the list, and he was like, "What's all that?" And I said, "Well, you told me to go around and get everybody's needs and wants." And he goes, "Well, how did you separate it out?" I was like, "These are all the needs. These are all the wants." And so yeah, it was a really interesting experience, and I got coached for, I bet it was 45 minutes to an hour. I wasn't planning on being there after 5 o'clock. I was going to meet my buddies over at the bar for a beer, and
right.
Yeah. So I ended up getting a homework assignment that night. I had to skip the beer and the buddies and go to the house and do some work. So that was my first experience, and I learned a lot. And ever since then, I took the budgeting experience serious.
Yeah, because so let's come to let's go to the second part of that story, which is, I'm assuming you were presenting this to some decision makers somewhere, and you know, you had to go before them and present this list of needs and wants. Am I correct about that?
That is correct. So I was actually just there to support my boss, and explain why we needed those things, and how it related to the work we were performing or to the clients we were supporting. And so I was just the details guy. He was the guy that was doing all the presenting because he had that experience, and
Gotcha.
that in itself was a learning experience as well, because you don't go in there in grave detail. You go in there with an executive summary
Right.
on why you're asking for that money and how it relates to the business, and is it driving any revenue or additional value. So that was a real good experience.
Well, let's kind of walk forward from there a bit, and let's think a little bit about, so over the years you've done this process now a lot of times, right? In various forms and in different organizations, which, I mean, budgeting is not, it's not the same everywhere. People do it differently. In fact, it's never been the same anywhere I've ever been. It's as unique as marketing plans or anything else, despite the fact that you might think it'd be more vanilla. That's not been my experience. I'm guessing it's not the same for you. What are some of the, if you think about the kind of take that first example and then, stack on top of it the things you've, the experiences you've had since where maybe you were continuing to support and then became the person doing the presenting, putting the budget together and presenting it to the decision makers. What are some of the key lessons that you've learned to try to help make that process go more smoothly?
That's a good question. And you're right. It varies from organization to organization. And this one that I'm in today, the group that I have working for me, I have to be very specific about my expectations on line item detail, showing business value, putting it in a prioritized fashion, and then also making sure that others can, gain value or benefit from it as well. Try to create that collaboration where you're having the larger conversations with partners and peers and people in your department, outside your department, to make sure that if I go make this investment, or if I'm going to go up for this ask, how can you leverage what I'm going to invest in? And that way it doesn't drive any duplicate investments or wasted dollars into the same technology. Maybe it's just a different provider or a service, same thing. And, how can you garner that larger message with those partners and peers to say, this is an investment we all agree and go make. And then that way the CFO can say, sign off on it. I understand the value. I understand the breadth and the depth of which you guys are going to use this and how it's going to either build revenue for us or drive value into the organization. And even security now, I've noticed that here recently is more and more conversations around budgeting are, did you get with security?
Yeah. And put a pin in that because I want to talk about that because that's a, 25 years ago that wouldn't have been something that people would have talked about in any kind of a value context or right. It would have just been assumed away, embedded in something else or not talked about at all probably, but we'll outside of healthcare or banking, some areas where it's always mattered, if you will.
And when we touch on that, there's a flip side to that too.
All right. Well, we're going to get there. So, you gave an example, or you gave the example of your current organization and kind of the budgeting process. And I know that's fresh in your mind because we talked and I know you're kind of in that mode right now. Contrast that maybe to a couple of prior organizations you've been a part of. What would be, maybe we can learn a little bit from some differences of approach and the lessons themselves.
Yeah. And I think, the experiences have been different. Like, for example, when I first got to community health systems, right, I reported into the CIO. And so the CIO had a very large organization, I want to say 12 to 1,500 people. And during budgeting time, and even actually using an approved budget was a bit of a challenge because you were trying to compete with what the CIO had for their initiatives. Whereas today, I report into a CIO, but he's got 4 distinct lines of operation, and I'm just one of them. And actually, I'm probably the only one that's not an operations team, but he clearly makes sure that everybody has their own account for budgeting and spending, and you're responsible for that. Don't go over it.
Right. So you got a pot of money as opposed to being, everybody's lining up in a scrum to try to get their share, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm in control of my own money. And if I have to take away to give to something else, I can do that. Whereas before I had to go negotiate in that scrum, hey, can you give up some dollars that you just got? Because I need to go do this. And that was always, a challenge because once you've got that money, man, that's like a death grip right there.
Yeah, the endowment effect is real in organizations, just like it is personally, right? Once you get money, it's always hard to give it up, right? It's easier to give it up if you've never had it.
I don't like
That's
giving up my personal money. I definitely don't like giving up the money that I'm allocated in my space. So,
right, right.
absolutely.
So along the lines in this process, again, you've had a solid career, a couple decades. Who's kind of helped you along the way? Where you mentioned the first gentleman who was you were helping support, and you learned some things from him. But where along the path, where else did you learn to help learn how did you learn to deal with the budgeting process, and who were your teachers in that process?
Yeah, great question. There's a guy you may know him. A lot of folks do around town. Jason Barnett. He's the CISO over at HCA. He was one of the first real influences around budgeting, the thought process behind what you're budgeting for. Doing the pre-work leading up to it, meaning having those peer conversations, those partner conversations. He wasn't afraid to challenge somebody on, why do you need that? Or are we really using that? And I mean, there's a professional way he would approach the conversation to understand the details instead of being so direct, like generally I am. And through his thought process, I learned, I'd say I matured and got more experienced in preparing, executing, and then managing after the fact. So he was a big influence. And then there was a guy named Mike O'Shea that used to be the CTO over at Community Health. He came from Mass Mutual, and his approach to budget was a little bit different, but at the same time the same, in that he would like to do roadmaps and then figure out, all right, how do we start accounting for the ask? What is it going to be, CapEx, OpEx? What is it going to do for the hospitals that we managed at the time? So he was another big influence on my approach to budgeting. And so I'd say the one thing I have noticed is each time I've had one of those experiences, the amount of money that I'm budgeting for has significantly increased. I want to say, I think this past budgeting cycle when I was at Cerner was I think my operating budget was around 32 million. So it's gotten bigger.
The zeros are adding up. Yeah.
Yeah, they are. They definitely are.
So related question, that any teachers, so to speak, that were not inside the IT or the technology side of the house, any CFOs or operational people that you feel like had a big impact, had an impact?
There's a guy named Larry Cash that used to be the CFO at Community Health Systems. I reported directly to him at a period of time, and then I think Tom Aaron took over. He had a little bit different style, and then Kevin Hammonds took over. And Kevin's a really good teacher as well. Both him and Larry taught me a lot, and that's when I guess I got my exposure into more of hospital operations as I was thinking about security, because they were challenging me around the hospital operations revenue cycle and making sure that we were accounting for them. And when I first started in healthcare, one thing I want to point out, I remember this, I think this would have been at HCA, it used to be that their mindset, meaning the CFOs and COOs, were of the mindset that you don't need that technology. We need to get a new MRI machine, or we need to get a new radiology system. And now today, I was reading some Gartner articles and talking to an analyst in preparation for budgeting that we have coming up this month. They're starting to spend more on cybersecurity than they are the medical devices.
Interesting.
So that is interesting.
Yeah, and so again, I don't want to foreshadow too much, but when we talk about risk, this is a good example of how at least the mindset around it has changed, right? For certain, because an MRI machine, a CFO, that was an easy model, right? You spend, I don't know, $1 million, $5 million. I have no idea how much an MRI machine costs. I figure they're expensive, and then that thing's supposed to run for 10 years or whatever long it is, and you need to get X number of pictures out of it that you charge X for, and there you go, right? I mean, that's a math problem that a CFO could love, right? cybersecurity is not, or didn't used to be. What the hell am I going to do with that? Right. I think was probably the answer you would have gotten.
Yeah. So, that's a great example right there, Brian. If I can share this with you, when you're talking about experiences, one of the things I've caught myself doing probably over the last, let's see, I was at Community for 14 years, so probably over the last 10 years, I've started factoring in risk from a risk register. And what I try to do is I try to get a risk register built across the business.
Now, what's a risk register? Define your terms for us.
Okay, so a risk register is something you would keep like in a governance, risk, and compliance technology. And what they do is they input all their risk, whether they're external facing, could be market, could be economy, it could be regulation, and then they factor in all their internal risk, and then they risk rank them according to
use some sort of rubric. I mean, a 1 to 5, or how does it?
They usually each company does it a little bit different, but there's a risk ranking process that they go through, and then they build the plan of actions and milestones, the POAMs, as we use abbreviations in technology all the time. And from that, you build cost models into that, so that when you go to the CFO and say, "Hey, we got this risk, and we need this investment to go get it done. Is it worth the value?" And so what we've learned is over the last 10 years is we're starting to use that in our discussions for the funding that we're.
So that's become a quantification. I mean, it's a way of quantifying value, right? Even though it's not. I mean, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was when you talk to business partners internally, around, I'll call it the budget negotiation process, because let's face it, that's what this is, right? When you're talking about, there's never enough money that everybody wants to spend. That's just the reality of the situation. And the terminology in business is pretty common across enterprises, right? There's things like return on investment, or cost versus investment, or there's a lot of language that comes from the accounting and finance side of the house, right? That is there for good reason, but sometimes doesn't necessarily always fit the circumstance. And the example I always give, the simplest one, and I think somebody at the event we had last couple weeks ago gave this example or compared it to, and it's the best one I've ever heard, which is, risk mitigation is insurance, right? You are buying insurance, just like you buy, property and casualty insurance to protect your car or your house, right? And the reality of that stuff is you hope you pay the premium every year and never never have to actually cash in and get a claim, right? Because that means you had a loss, and you're never going to get made 100% whole with insurance, right? And so now cybersecurity risk is not it's not a perfect analog, but it's something like that. But it's interesting. So tell me a little bit more about this risk registry and sort of this idea of and have you had to teach people that over the years, and now is it kind of becoming common parlance?
So I'll tell you, it's really helped. It's really helped drive the conversations with the partners, right? So you get some insight into their world and what some of their challenges are, or it also will even create the picture of maybe, when we made this investment 5 years ago, we didn't really implement it to support the business, right? And now we need to make adjustments, or the business has changed and we just never adjusted to the business. And so, yeah, it gives you insight into one, their priorities, two, it also creates the conversation of challenging them to say, well, you bought this investment 5 years ago, you didn't implement it right. What makes you think if we make another investment that we're going to do it right? And it drives maybe a larger strategic conversation around, here's all your business requirements, here's what it should look like. Okay, we don't have to make that much of an investment, but we'll ask for maybe a fourth of it now this year. We'll plan for 2 years, the other fourth or the other half or whatever amount, until you get it actually implemented the way it should be done. So, yeah, I have seen, I guess, so what I'm saying is I have seen where they've made investments that are wasted costs, and then they have to make future investments to correct what was wasted the first time. So those kind of conversations come out quite a bit too. And it's good though that the risk register provides you that opportunity, because at the same time can be used like say you have a security incident, right? You can then go and in the healthcare, if it's significant enough that you have to go report it to the OCR, or even like if it impacts patients, the Attorney General's office will get involved. And what it does is it gives you the capability during that audit or that corrective action plan. It gives you the ability to say, "Hey, we made these investments, and hey, we corrected these things."
Right.
So it is part of what we do from a CISO perspective. Um, I will say that a little bit of a spin on that is when I first started going into the hospitals and talking to CEOs and CFOs and COOs, it's funny to hear the CFO will have a different opinion than, say, a CEO or COO, because they're more plugged into the physicians and hearing what their needs are, or hearing what challenges they have in the delivery of clinical care. So to hear somebody that's at the corporate office that's managing a bunch of acute care hospitals is going to have a different budgeting process request versus what they'll have within the hospital operations themselves. So that I find.
I think that's pretty common. Not just in healthcare, but probably, I mean, it's the further away you are from, from the line, so to speak, the harder it is to know, really understand what's going on. Right. I mean, I think it's the nature, or it's just like knowing, I mean, customers, how close can you get to your customers and really understand their issues, right? It's always a challenge. How much, talking about the risk register is a curious thing and an interesting thing to me, especially when I think about, more, you've worked mostly in larger organizations, at least in your recent past. It sounded like early on, maybe you were at a little bit smaller places, but how does that scale? Can you think about how that scales down? Well, does it scale down? I think it does, but put on a mid-market small company hat and talk to me about how you think that would scale down. Maybe it scales down just straight out, but I'm just curious your thinking on that as it relates to small to mid-sized companies.
Yeah, no, I think it does scale down. And I think it scales. Yeah, I think it scales pretty seamlessly. It's just, you can use a Excel spreadsheet to create a risk register. You can go out online and Google and look up, risk register, and it'll tell you, pretty standard fields that you would want to track. And I think, that would help you understand where your investments need to be made, because you can classify them as, potential revenue opportunities. You could classify them as reduced operating cost over here, so that you can redirect those funds to grow another part of the business. So I think you could definitely customize your risk register to support whatever size business you are.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. We've talked some about, the budgeting process over the years, and with technology changing as much as it has in the past couple of decades, there's been a host of new technologies that have really been developed, particularly, cloud and SaaS, and the old CapEx versus OpEx, right? There's not as many CapEx opportunities as there used to be. And some people are thrilled about that, and some people maybe not so much, depending on the circumstances. But how do you see that having impacted the budgeting process? And do you think it's made it easier or harder? Or maybe both, but if it has, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, when I came to Cerner, well, no, actually, when I was leaving Community Health Systems, probably the last 3 or 4 years that I was there, they were transitioning some of the services to the cloud. Because you're right, that CapEx model versus OpEx was starting to shift. And hospitals and hospital corporations live off of CapEx for the most part, and they try to minimize their operating expenses so their bottom line looks better, and they can generate more money for shareholders where there are. But as I transitioned over to Cerner, we have a very big cloud footprint, and the budgeting process has gotten much harder. And the reason I state that is because, if you're using something like O365 or G Suite, there's a flat rate, and generally they give you up to so much storage space for your shared drives. But Yeah, as you start to move your applications, like AWS charges
Yeah.
you every time you
Consumption
want.
based. Yeah.
That's
Consumption based,
right.
another whole ball game for
Yes,
sure.
it is. And so, you've got to be pretty accurate about how you budget that and account for that utilization. And as you add more customers, that that utilization just continues to climb, and so it gets very expensive very quick. Um, but from a technology standpoint, I mean, you are provided different options. So you not only think about for everything you build in that environment, whether it's network, whether it's compute, whether it's storage, security, it's all got a cost, right? And so, yeah, if you there are ways that you can do better forecasting for those type of things. Different tools for that. There's just about a tool for everything nowadays. That's
Yeah.
why the first question was a little bit hard to answer. And so, yeah, we've seen challenges around managing budgets and forecasting budgets since
Yeah.
we've got a big cloud footprint.
Yeah. We certainly hear that a lot from our customers that it's a struggle. And honestly, you know, cloud and SaaS, I mean, we're still pretty new at this game, right? And so I think we have to keep that in mind. We will probably get better. And I mean, we collectively, as an industry, at helping ourselves to do, to try to bring a little more, I use the word certainty loosely, but a little more certainty to the cost picture. I mean, a lot of it is that, the creation of, application processes, particularly if you're moving legacy applications to the cloud. And I mean legacy in the sense that they weren't built exclusively to use consumption based workloads, right? If they're old school database driven applications that, those were built with a different delivery package in mind, right? And so conforming those to consumption based models is tricky. Like it's not easy. And it's an easy place for people to oversell the benefits of the cloud a lot of times, and then realize in the short term, ouch, this is a lot more expensive than I thought it was going to be, because refactoring is hard, and converting to microservices and container, all the things that all these really cool things you can do that aren't simple to do if you're trying to fly a plane with that application, right? And that's I would imagine you're smack dab in the middle of that at some, with some situations, or have been, where business partners are like, wait a minute, like, yeah, we need that application, but now it's more expensive. It's twice as expensive as it used to be. And it's like, well, what do you want me to do?
Right. I moved it to the cloud. That's where everybody's going.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. And, you make a good point, because with all the change in technology around containers and yeah, it's just gotten to the point where security is getting more costly around all those environments that they build. And you have to be very cognizant of who has access to build what, because I've seen them spikes like crazy.
That's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that, but I didn't really think about the complexity of the environment because of the flexibility in app development deployment, creating a bigger surface area or more complexity from a protection standpoint. That makes perfect sense. That leads to, I think, kind of right into the next question in terms of thinking about living in this world of risk mitigation. You've talked some about the risk register. My assumption is business partners vary wildly in terms of their ability to grasp or easily understand risk, or intuitively have a sense of it within their own operation. So what are some ways you found to help internal business partners think more effectively about risk? And maybe it's just helping them understand and think through the risk registry process, because if you do that, if you sort of trust the process, to use the old Nick Saban phrase, on the backside of that, you'll educate yourself in the process. Maybe that's the answer, but I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Yeah. Not every business partner thinks about risk, right?
Well, I assume they have different risk tolerances for themselves too, right? So that has to be a factor.
Yeah, they do. And a lot of times you'll hear them say, I've got a problem. And I'm like, what's your problem? And then when they start explaining it to you, you're like, no, that's a risk to the organization, to you, to your outcomes. And they're like, what do you mean? And so as you start to explain what a risk is, and then, you talk to them about, you can actually build a model around this that will show you what it would cost you to solve your problem, with the air quotes there.
Can you give an example? That's a really interesting distinction, and I haven't really thought about it like that. It doesn't have to be a real example, or it can. I don't care who it is or what, but someone who said I have a problem, you said no, you have a risk. Can you give an example of what that is?
Yeah. So for example, everybody, I'm sure a lot of people have heard this: small, medium-sized, large organizations, shadow IT, right? Um, so I've had some business partners that will hire IT guys within their department, right? And what they're doing is they're trying to build a service that they need that should have been done by the CIO or by the IT department. And so they'll go make a purchase and put a huge fancy desktop or server underneath this person's desk, and they'll be like, okay, here's where you go to get the data, and here's the reporting that I need, and
we're going to cut the red tape. We're going to get a guy. He's a smart guy. He understands databases. He's going to build this analytics thing for us. Boom, he's off to the races. He knows Power BI. He knows SQL.
Yeah, exactly. And oh, by the way, if you plug it into all these systems, I mean, you just gave
get more data,
an immediate path right in. Yeah. So yeah, that's an example. And then when you start talking to them, and you're like, that's not a problem because I don't have anybody to run this anymore. They left. Well, yeah, because it's a dead end job going nowhere, just being, a data monkey all day. That's all they are.
Right.
And so, when you start talking to them about it, this is a risk, and here's why it's a risk. And it's not just the risk to you, it's a risk to the company. We have a solution over here called the Enterprise Data Warehouse. Why don't we put it in your budget to get professional services if IT doesn't have the bandwidth or the capacity to come and do it? And we make sure that we account for the licensing and any software that the people that manage the Enterprise Data Warehouse do it. And then that way you go into a controlled environment, secured environment.
Right. Connectivity, that the data you got, that the data is going to be handled properly in terms of ingress and egress, storage, all that good stuff.
Yeah, roles-based access, limited, predefined reports, canned reports, and here is the process to request new things. And so it's good to see that because, one, it keeps the CFO happy because you're standardizing on a process and investment that was already made. You quit wasting those operating dollars having that salary and software on that computer and that database. And so that's an example of what we see from time to time as what they consider to be a problem, but it's actually a risk.
Right. Okay. That's fair. That was an interesting distinction. I was thinking that there might be people listening who were like, what exactly does he mean by that? So that's a good example. So, we're kind of starting to roll up on time. So I want to try to head towards the end here. I got a few more questions, and this one's I'm not necessarily about war stories here, but they're always kind of fun to get a few every now and then. So can you tell us a little bit about, if you, maybe the most difficult or challenging budget cycle you've ever had to deal with? And maybe it was because, I'm thinking of like a situation that was really fraught economically, like, shit had kind of hit the fan economically for that the business was dealing with, or there were some real internal issues going on. And so, it was kind of it was a tough deal. Maybe a story around that would be interesting.
Yeah.
I figured you've had those by now.
I do have those, and I'm figuring out which one to pick out, right?
I was hoping you only had one or two, but I also know that, life is not always a bed of roses. So,
I won't say the company name, but let me put it to you this way. We were in the process of an acquisition, and we do our due diligence. We're getting ready to close. And the day before, I'm headed back down to the location to finish up the due diligence pieces and get prepped for day one, go live. We find out that there was only a small number of people transitioning into IT and security that we had to take on all of their responsibilities after we built their budgets, and they were like, we don't have money for budgets except for salaries. So figure it out. And so, as you can imagine, I get down there and, yeah, there was a lot of unhappy people.
I'd say so. That it's a little bit of Lucy with the football on that one, for you.
Yeah, that was an interesting time. And I was still early on in my career too.
How'd you navigate that? What was your approach?
I pulled my leadership together and said, look, we've got a challenge in front of us. Here's what we've got to do. We've got to make this work. Let's figure out what's waste. Go ahead and just get rid of it. Understand the impacts first before you do that. But if there's waste that we can just do away with, let's do away with it. Are there opportunities for us to leverage existing products and licenses and processes, and that's not going to cost us anything, and incorporate that into our stuff? We were, I'd say, 70% successful, and I'd probably being generous on that maybe. But everything comes with failures. That's how you learn, right?
Right.
And so,
some might say that's a fairly impossible situation. So, if you could have a little bit of success with that, squeezing, some juice out of that lemon, what else are you going to do? Right. I mean, at the end of the day. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, I've had the opposite of that. I've been acquired, and acquiring company, you start submitting requisitions and they're like, budget, you don't have a budget. I'm like, well, we did before you acquired us. No, right. No, you don't. So yeah, I've been on both sides of that.
I got you. Okay, well,
I was going to ask a question about cost cutting, but now I don't need to because it just got answered. So there you go. I guess last question before we kind of get to a couple of non-work things to bring us home. And this is, again, platitudes are dangerous. So, maybe if you can give me some specifics, that'd be great. Not that it's easy, but if you could try. So what advice would you give to anyone who's trying to get better at managing, the IT budgeting process for their company? I mean, obviously that's a big range of people and situations, but what are 2 or 3 things that you feel like are sort of, best practices or core principles that have worked for you, and that as you've looked around, you've seen have worked for others?
Categorizing. And what I mean by that, must-haves, could-haves, and nice-to-have. Just prioritize into those categories and then figure out, one, what can you get done? Do you have the resources to support it ongoing after that? Is there duplication, across peers and the company? Figure out how to remove the waste, I guess, is what I'm trying to say is a good thing. Identify where you've already made existing investments and can grow it because they've got additional modules or they've got capabilities now built into the upgrades that you've implemented in your organization. And then, definitely have those conversations with peers and partners. Figure out how you guys can create one voice of, we need to make this investment, we're committed to it, and maybe we don't do these other 2 things. Be willing to give up something to get something.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, and I think I'm always reminded of Dale Carnegie's, he says the way to win friends and influence people is speak in terms of other people's interests. And it seems like that's maybe the core principle for IT is, at the end of the day, we're not really an end in itself. I mean, there are certain things that are, but in general, it's to help the business do whatever it needs to do, because most businesses are not IT businesses. They are operational businesses that do provide products and services to people and other companies, and they use IT to get that stuff done, right? And so that seems to me to be, maybe that's a good one to quit on for the talk, is that sort of idea. And I think you've in listening to you talk, if you didn't know you were an IT person from the intro, you wouldn't have known it necessarily from the conversation, which I think means you've kind of adopted that. So that explains, I'm sure, a good part of your success, among other things. So congratulations on that.
So thank you.
All right. So again, to wrap up with a couple of personal / non-work things. The first one is, I know you're busy, especially with the acquisition. You got a 11-year-old, so you got a bunch going on. But What's something you've watched or read lately that you think others ought to check out?
You know, couple
Other than
things.
TikTok.
Yeah. No, we're not talking about TikTok anymore. Oh my Lord. So I was reading an article not too long ago. We're talking about cost budgets, right? And a lot of companies are paying attention to how much spend is going out the door operating wise into cloud providers. And the article was interesting because, it named the big ones, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and they're going more to that mid-tier data center cloud provider because more cost affordable. Do they get all the solutions that, the big ones offer? Maybe not necessarily. But they are starting to see that trend of moving from the top tier to more of the mid to small tier, depending on the size of your company, to manage your cost a lot better. So that to me was interesting. And
was that an article you said that you read?
Yeah, it was an article. I'll try to find it. And
yeah, because I'll say if you could send me the link afterwards, we'll drop it in the show notes so people can check it out. That'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And then something that I've seen lately I don't know if a lot of people probably already have, but if you haven't seen the new Top Gun, that still resonates with me. And I saw that like several months ago.
Yeah, it was. We talked about it I've talked about it with my peers of my age. I'm 51, so I remember when the original came out, and it's not very often that you say a sequel this far in the past. It's better than the first one, and the first one was really good, or at least that's my opinion. But that's how good I felt like it was. Like it was really well done, and generally sequels are not good.
Right. Yeah, the only other one I can think of that's still going, that's still good is John Wick.
That's true. That's a good example. Yeah.
John Wick is like the new Matrix.
Yeah, I'll never forget the first time I watched that one. I was like, man, be nice to people's dogs. If there's one lesson you learn from that movie, there you go. So, all right, last question. Tell us about your first technology memory as a child. Maybe it was a gaming system, early stage computer. Can't be the phone or the TV. Like that's boring. Everybody knows that. So something outside of that.
First video game as a kid was the Odyssey.
Oh, okay. Hadn't heard that one in a while. Yeah, I forgot about Odyssey. Yeah, I forgot about the Odyssey.
Video game, yeah. It looked like a big box that had a keyboard on it, and it looked like you stuck 8-track tapes into it, like the old Atari cartridges.
Yep.
First computer, it was Commodore 64.
That's the first one I remember too. My friend had one. I didn't have one, but my buddy had one.
Yeah. And then first time I programmed was an Apple IIe in second grade.
Did you have a book or something? You follow the instructions?
Yeah. They somebody donated to our school 4 or 5 different Apple IIe computers, and they had some kind of advanced class that there was like 6 of us in, and that's what our class was, or I don't even know if it was part of our curriculum or what, but they put us in a room and they were like,
here you go.
This is a new craze. Like,
'cause I can't imagine there was a teacher that knew how to teach you anything on it. So
she read the book the night before, she said, and that's how we learned how to do the coding the next day. And it was simple stuff. Images on the screen and stuff like that. That basic. Yeah. But
I remember them. They'd come line by line. It'd be this like triangle looking thing. And it was amazing that it happened. At the time, it certainly was like magic. And honestly, the technology just feels more like magic now than it ever did. To be honest, I don't know. There's really any other way to describe it. So
yeah.
Well, Scott, that's all I've got. I'll let you get back to work. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us on Cut the Shit. We really appreciate it.
No, I appreciate you having me, Bryan, and thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, we'd appreciate it if you would become a subscriber wherever you get your podcasts. And if you could rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, that would really help us out. Or you can just go old school and tell your friends, your family, your colleagues, and hell, anybody else who you think might want to hear something like this to listen in. If you're on social media, make sure to follow us on Twitter, Our handle is at @cuttheshit_pod. We are also on TikTok at @cuttheshitpod, all one word, where we post lots of clips from the podcast. And last but not least, you can also watch the YouTube version of the show on our YouTube channel, @Plow Networks. Until next time, take care and have a great day.